Joined by Marc Faber. He's the editor and publisher of the Gloom, Boom, Doom report, and that can be found at gloomboomdoom.com. Good evening, Dr. Faber. Welcome, and thank you for taking my call and at this evening hour on June 1st. I presume that your monthly newsletter was released last night or perhaps this morning. Any particular thoughts that were guiding that newsletter?
Well, the major theme I'm exploring now is, when I was born in 1946, until the 90s, I experienced more and more freedom from a very strict environment in 1950. The world really opened up and you could travel more and it became less expensive. And life became more and more liberal, especially after the flower revolution in the late 60s. And after the late 1990s, and I'm not referring here specifically to Hong Kong, but after the late 1990s, we had 9/11 in 2001, which restricted security for people already. In other words, you were checked at airports, and if you happened to have a nail clipper in your hand luggage, they almost arrested you. And then we had more and more restrictions on people's lives, and in the financial sector, the business was essentially taken over by compliance people. And sometimes you ask yourself, these compliance people, are they actually working for the bank or for the government? And now we had this coronavirus, COVID-19, and again, the way the bureaucracy has behaved in especially Western countries, I have to specify this, in the Western countries that always say, oh, we have democracies and the democratic system is superior and so forth. And they've taken measures that are like very draconian measures against people's personal freedom. So I'm asking myself, how far will that go? And I think we have to remember one thing. We, Western civilization, that adopted the capitalistic system and laissez-faire economics, free markets, we became a generation or an era of unprecedented wealth in the world. That we can't overlook. And it's not only benefited the Western world. Many other countries have also become very prosperous because of the adoption of free market policies and the capitalistic system. And our contribution of the West was really to have legal standards that were very strong. So the civilization at the present became prosperous largely because of free markets. And the other system of economics, the socialist system, if you went, and I've been to Czechoslovakia in 1968 already, and then to Russia and China before the opening of these countries, the socialist planned economy was a complete failure. That people have to realize. So you have on the one hand the extreme where the capitalistic system created prosperity, and the other system, the socialist economic system, where the government plans everything, became a complete disaster, economically speaking and standards of living speaking. But that young people don't want to realize. They always say, oh, the government should do this, the government should do that. It's never, I should take personal responsibility for my action. And that, for me, is a very disturbing trend. It's not that I have sleepless nights over it because of my age. I don't really care. But I think when I look at my life that became freer and freer. And now I have some bureaucrats that are dumb like the moon that tell me what I can do and what I can't do. That is the disturbing fact.
Right.
And
absolutely.
they're not even elected people. They work for the government. These are bureaucrats, you understand? And the heavy-handed measures they undertake, they have no clue whether they're right or wrong.
So you're referring here to the coronavirus sort of lockdown, or you're
yes,
just...
but I'm saying that I think Western governments are using the coronavirus as an excuse to screw the people even more, to tighten the screws on their security and so forth, and control the masses.
Absolutely. We're all concerned that the tracking devices that are being introduced for things like virus tracking or movement tracking, we're not going to get rid of these things when the virus goes away eventually.
I'm not so worried about the tracking device. But, you know, there are other measures that the bureaucracy could introduce, like mandatory vaccines and so forth. And it is clear to me that although in reality or by name, the eugenics movement no longer exists, in practice, there are still some people that believe in population control, and who knows what the virus, these vaccines will contain. Maybe they also control the way you think.
Let me just turn the issue to the recent events in Hong Kong. I'm actually sitting here in Hong Kong, and I think we first met in your office here in Hong Kong in about 1997.
Yes.
So you were a long-term resident in the city. You've probably read the news last week that the NPC, National People's Congress, is moving ahead with a national security bill for Hong Kong, and I believe it's passed and will come into law in possibly September. So in light of that, what does that make you think about Hong Kong in particular? Are you still optimistic, or?
Well, as you know, or maybe, I don't know whether you got it, in 1997, I wrote a small book, The Rise and the Fall of Great Cities. And in it, I described that each time an independent city became part of an empire, whether it was Salzburg or Tangier or Venice, the conditions for the city changed a lot, because they were then part of an empire or a country and no longer an independent trading city. And I wrote at the time that obviously Hong Kong would become a city of China, that for a while maybe they would still have some privileges, but in the long run, the privileges would be eroded, and then Hong Kong would have to compete with other Chinese cities. And there's nothing wrong about that. Hong Kong, and I think young people must realize that this is a fact. Hong Kong belongs to China. You can't argue about this fact. There's a contract between Britain and China, which is contained in the Basic Law. But the Basic Law is not the will of the people. It was drafted between Britain and China. It took probably in consideration some of the views of local Hong Kong Chinese, but it's not a document that is signed by the will of the people. And in this document, there is actually a clause whereby a national security law has to be introduced, either by Hong Kong or China obviously has the right to do that. And so I don't think that it's such a big deal. I also like to say the law, the way it is written, is like the Constitution in America, is one thing. the interpretation of the law is a totally different thing. And, you know, the way China will interpret these security laws is obviously up to them because they have the power. So this is a little bit an angle that needs to be considered. But I would not put up a huge fuss about the securities laws. I would not dream. I would be realistic. And the reality is Hong Kong is part of China. And if the Hong Kong Chinese chose not to learn Mandarin, it's their own problem. And if they chose to let their standards of English go down, it's their own problem. That is the reality. That is the problem.
But we saw on Friday, President Donald Trump made a statement, and we're sort of waiting on the follow-up of what was contained in that statement. We don't know what measures the states might take. They view that the basic law has been breached, the joint declaration has been breached, and they may revoke Hong Kong's special trading status with the U.S. That's in the cards. And
I want to tell you something about the special trading status of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has practically no domestic exports to the US, okay? It has re-exports. The re-exports are taxed in the US at the rate of each country's origin. Whether, say, a TV is manufactured in China, it's shipped through Hong Kong, so the Hong Kong re-exports is that the tariff is on China's duty. But Hong Kong is one of the largest importer of US goods. So what do they want to tax on Hong Kong? Trump should look after his own business. And there are several cities in the US that have been burning. That is his business. He has no business to even talk about Hong Kong.
But one of the issues would be that it is the banking center for offshore business coming out of China and inward bound investment heading into China. Now, if there were barricades that were put up in some sense, so in other words, if the U.S. banks were forced to move out because of restrictions placed on the clearing of funds here by the U.S., my question is, in essence, this is an asset base. There are airlines here, we have property companies here, we have banks. I'm presuming there must be a new risk factor in investing in these Hong Kong companies or having assets here, or even investing in Chinese companies at this time when there's just a growing trade war and friction between the U.S. and after the coronavirus, friction between China and the world increasingly.
An investor who buys Hong Kong share, he's not so concerned about these issues. He's concerned whether the shares are low or high. And all I can say is, based on price to book values and compared to US companies, also in terms of financial stability, Hong Kong property companies are very inexpensive because A, they hardly use any leverage. As you know, in Hong Kong, most property companies have a very large shareholder that is a family. The families have been running these businesses very conservatively. Sometimes they have debts of only 20% of assets, sometimes 30%. Lots of buildings in Hong Kong, they're owned free and clear, no mortgage. And please tell me where in the US you have property companies that have such a low leverage. So as an investor, I'm looking around the world and say, okay, Hong Kong, I'm aware what the risks are, but the stocks are very cheap. And by the way, I'm interested to own companies in China in the long run. The only proviso is, of course, if a war breaks out, the investment will not be very good. But if Hong Kong, and this is the future of Hong Kong, But the dumb demonstrators in Hong Kong, they don't see that. The future is the Greater Bay Area, with Hong Kong being essentially the financial center, and technology in Shenzhen, factories, Dongguan, and so forth and so on. Hong Kong itself, as a city, can be a shopping center and nothing else. Who's going to produce anything in Hong Kong? Tell me. And by the way, I mean, the people, the demonstrators, I have to say, I've seldom seen a dumber crowd of people. They don't realize that China, in split seconds, can switch off the water supplies to Hong Kong. If I had a master, a landlord, who can switch off my water on any excuse, I'd be very nice to him, I tell you. I'd be very nice to him.
But I want to raise a question. The Hong Kong dollar it's been pegged to the US dollar since 1983, I believe. And some economists, some hedge funds are placing big bets that that dollar peg isn't going to last. And we've had, in particular, Kyle Bass mention that he thinks it's one of the most vulnerable dollar linked currency exchanges in the world. So that was even before the coronavirus and before the national security law issue came up. Now, if you're investing in Hong Kong stocks and you're an international investor, aren't you exposing yourself to currency risk in Hong Kong?
First of all, I have to clarify one point. Carly Bass was initially always bearish about Japanese government bonds and the Japanese yen. That was his first big thing. So for about 15 years, he's been talking down the yen and Japanese government bonds. On both counts, he was completely wrong, okay? This is the reality. Number two, there are a group of people in the US and around the world. They are the perennial China bashers. You wonder why? Because China has not done great harm to anyone outside China, whereas most everyone outside China has in history done great harm to China. So these China bashers, I sometimes wonder what they are thinking. I know that they think that China has stolen some property rights from companies. The US in the 19th century stole everything, all manufacturing processes and inventions from Britain, including books. So that, just to put the record clear. So Charlie Bass, after being bearish about Japan for so long, and he wasn't bearish about the stock market, he was bearish about the bond market, which has done fantastically well over the last 10, 15 years. And the yen has also done well. So now, about 5 years ago, he began to turn his attention onto China and the Hong Kong dollar. Now, the Hong Kong dollar, as long as we have the current system of peg, they can maintain the exchange rate for a long time. And as you know, in Hong Kong, the stock market has been relatively weak, and the property market has also come down, not as much as the stock market, but it has come down now. And I'd say the peg could easily stay here. I have argued already in the 1990s that it was a mistake to peg the Hong Kong dollars to the US dollar. They should have pegged it to a basket of currencies or have no peg at all. But that is a different issue. That is an issue economists can, argue about. But on the Hong Kong dollar, if the Hong Kong dollar breaks, say tomorrow, the Hong Kong dollar devalues. And I think there is a chance that the Hong Kong dollar could be repegged to the Chinese yuan. and then it would be 1-to-1. So over time, I think the Hong Kong dollar may disappear. Possible. It's not an urgency to do it, but it's a possibility. So let's say the Hong Kong dollar drops 10%. I think the next day, the stock market in Hong Kong will go up 10% because the asset value will adjust of stocks. So I'm not that concerned. I'm more concerned what will happen to the US dollar, to tell you the truth. I think the imbalances in the US are such that the world currency status, the reserve currency status of the US will become unglued. It is not feasible that it will last forever. I think the US dollar has a downside risk against other currencies, notably against gold and bitcoins, in the order of 50% or so. So if I were boss, I wouldn't worry about Hong Kong. I would worry about my own country in the US. The US is always very good at being concerned about everybody else's affairs, and themselves, they mess it up or F it up.
So
I love these Americans, always concerned about somebody else's business, but themselves, they have an incredible mess. Just look at the last 4 presidents they had.
Arguably, you're right. But I do want to just spend a moment more on an issue that's so close to the hearts of people in Hong Kong. The news came out last week. I'm going to mention again the NPC and the National Security Law. And are you getting people asking your advice, like should they get their assets out of Hong Kong, or should we get our savings out of Hong Kong dollars and into other currencies? I imagine that question has come up to you in the past 7 days.
But I'd just like to say the following. I think if we talk about upper middle class and wealthy people, say they have assets of $1 million US, most of these people will have 80% of their cash in foreign currencies anyway. Do you understand? Nobody holds Hong Kong dollar deposits in the long run. Most Hong Kong Chinese, and I came to Hong Kong in 1973, so I know a lot of families, most of their money that is not invested in Hong Kong properties. Most of the money that is lying around in cash and their portfolios, most of it is in foreign stocks. Some have Hong Kong dollar portfolios, but these are hardcore Hong Kong dollar investors who believe no matter what happens, Hong Kong, through their adaptability, can adapt to new conditions. You understand? There are some people I know that have large Hong Kong share portfolios. They're not so concerned about what happens politically in Hong Kong. They think that Hong Kong, relative, and I'm speaking relative to the rest of the world, is still an attractive place. And as I said, Hong Kong shares are not very expensive.
Let me just take that point. When I look at the Hang Seng Index, we haven't had the bounce that the S&P 500 has had. So since the corona concerns came into view, past 3 months, we are kind of trading almost about the lows,
Correct.
The lowest of the darkest hour here.
Yes.
So we have discounted, and so your view, you're finding relatively good value in Hong Kong at the moment in the Hang Seng Index or the big blue chips.
Yes, I mean, I have concerns about shares being an attractive investment class overall, globally. And as you just said, the S&P has rebounded a lot, but the S&P doesn't tell you very much. If you analyze the S&P, it has rebounded a lot because maybe of 15 different shares. Amazon, Apple, Netflix, Facebook, and so forth. About 15 stocks. And the rest of the market is actually quite depressed. The S&P is not down, is maybe down 10% on the year, but the typical stock is down 18% year to date. So you understand, we have the S&P near all-time high, but you look at European markets, they're all down with the exception of Switzerland in the order of approximately 20%. Ditto for emerging markets. The S&P has performed particularly well, but it has performed particularly well for the last 10 years relative to other markets in the world. So that it outperforms Hong Kong is not surprising to me. But if you look at Chinese shares and Hong Kong shares, they have not collapsed the way Kylie Bass would like them to collapse. That I just like to make clear. The many companies in China that are up on the year. And that is the big surprise for Kylie Bass, who is talking down China on every occasion. Probably he's never talked anything else in his life for the last 5 years than to bash China. Exactly like Steve Bannon. There are people like this in the US because the US still believes that the US is entitled by God to be the master of the universe, that they should rule the whole world. That's why the US has military bases in over 150 different countries.
So good point. And one concern from my point of view would be if we're moving into an era of growing conflicts between the US and China,
correct,
isn't that bad for...
Yes, it's very bad, but I just like to say, the US being led by someone who has a very low level of intelligence and is dumb in the sense that he believes he knows everything, that's the president. The country, the US, believes that they hold all the aces in the game between China and the US, when in fact, if you analyze it very carefully, if it comes to a conflict, in my view, the US will suffer more, much more. And by the way, do you think the woke society in America, the ones that are running around and demonstrating against everything, and the ones that are demonstrating for women's rights and lesbians and everything, that these people will go and fight a war? That is the best joke I heard. The Americans, they will lose out if they start a war. I can tell you, because it will force other Asian countries to make a choice, either being neutral or on the side of the US or on the side of China. The most likely step is that they will remain neutral. But I can tell you, the ones that side with the US and allow military interventions from their territory, say the military base in the Philippines attacks China, I think the military base in the Philippines will disappear within 2 hours. This time around, the Chinese will not behave like during the Opium Wars. They'll hit back.
Interesting point, and I want to just push you on that. So we've all seen that map where China has a dotted line and it says the whole South China Sea, all those islands that are shared between different nations, that they are the property of China. And it's not just the US which is aggravating the situation. There's territorial disputes there that are within the region.
I'm not sure they say they are the property. But they have basically, I think, the problem with the territorial dispute is if you and I were running China, it's a country with 1.2, 1.3 billion people. We have the second largest economy in the world. And we are surrounded by military bases of the largest economy in the world, the US still the largest, at least on paper. I don't think it's in reality the largest, but on paper. And this country, the largest economy, the US, has all these military and naval bases around our country. And in theory, they could impose a kind of a blockade. So we too, running the 1.2 billion country, we might not get our oil, we may not get our copper, we may not get our iron ore, and so forth and so on. I think any country in the world in the position of China, and I have to say, I find the Chinese have been actually quite patient with the US. In fact, very patient. I think any country in the position of China, given the circumstances of now a rather hostile country in the form of the US, would want essentially these military and naval bases from the US to disappear from Southeast Asia, I think, and North Asia as well. I think that any military strategist who isn't an American would see it the same way I see
it. And what about where you are? So within Thailand, and I know that you're a fan of Vietnam and their development story, do you see that the rise of China and an aggressive China is also threatening, well, the growth or the outlook or the story there?
I think it's logical for small countries, given the size of China and given the size and the efficiency of Chinese manufacturing companies, that these smaller countries are concerned economically and also concerned to some extent politically. But look, again, I think people have to realize what the new environment is like. In Thailand, approximately 20% of the economy is tourism, tourist related. And of that tourist, 30% are from China. So if the Chinese no longer visit Thailand, the hotels are empty, period. It's just a fact of life. And they may like the Chinese or not like the Chinese, like the Hong Kong Chinese always complain about the mainland Chinese. When I came to Asia in '73, everybody in the Philippines and everywhere complained about the Hongkies, the Hong Kong Chinese, because they had such bad manners and were loud. So the Hong Kong Chinese shouldn't complain too much about the mainland Chinese. And the same, the Thais, they were complaining about the mainland Chinese, that they're loud and this and that they did this wrong and that wrong and so forth. I can say Chiang Mai is a center of tourism, mostly for Chinese. And I've never seen a Chinese drunk or behave very badly in Chiang Mai. But I've seen many Swiss, I'm Swiss, behave very badly in Chiang Mai. I've seen many expatriates from Europe, the US, behave very badly. So, I think there is an anti-Chinese sentiment, especially in America, and I find this anti-Chinese sentiment misplaced. It's almost, I hesitate to use the term racism, but I'm sorry to say that the Chinese who went to the US in the 19th century and built the railroads and so forth, they were treated like dogs. That's why they were settled in places like Chinatowns in Los Angeles and San Francisco and so forth. They were treated very, very badly. I'm not saying that they were treated much better in their own countries, but they were treated very badly. Probably worse than the slaves in the South, probably worse. But this is another subject. All I want to say, I think this anti-China sentiment and the Chinese bashing coming, in the case of Trump, it's clear. He became aware that it's a good way to get elected, to bash China. You know, that you rally the really simple minds. Most of these simple minds, they have a kitchen, they have a bathroom. 90% of what is in the bathroom, kitchens and garages comes from China. But they bash China. Thanks God someone built these things for them, because themselves they wouldn't be able to build it. So this anti-Chinese bashing will last until after the election. And after the election, Trump is not a man of principles. He's not a man of truth. George Soros calls him a charlatan. Yes, he is a complete charlatan. Knows nothing and talks big. After the election, he will become again and say, oh, Xi Jinping is my best friend. He's done it before.
But with Steve Bannon in the background, there is trying to articulate this case that China is a threat on some level. And we know some of their technological ambitions, just take AI. So in a number of years, China will surpass America as the supreme source of AI development. Yes. And
so why is this a threat? Why is this a threat? Why would anyone want to be the largest economic and global power? It's a burden. It's not a pleasure. I tell you, it's a burden.
Well, but throughout history,
people with no brains, they believe that they need to be the most powerful person.
Okay, but there is a race to sort of develop these technologies to essentially take control of all these amazing new tools that'll be our ability to do science.
May I come back to what I said at the beginning? The two major thoughts in economics doctrines. One is the dynamic model, the creative destruction, where new competitors come up with new methods of production, new ways, and innovate. And there is the model of stagnation, where the global economy is like several buildings with machines and nothing moves forward. And if you are, not an American, maybe if I were an American, I would look at the world differently. But I'm interested that the prosperity in the world spreads to the most possible number of people. And by just having a stagnating global economy and maintain the status quo will not bring more prosperity. But if we have a dynamic system, that China comes up, and then India comes up, and continuously things change. Otherwise, we would still have the dominance of Babylon or Egypt or the Roman Empire. You understand? The system has to be dynamic. Otherwise, we don't have free markets and we don't have a capitalistic system. And the feelings and the sentiment of Mr. Bannon really don't interest me at all. What interests me is that the maximum number of people in the world can prosper, because that is more likely to lead to peace than the kind of rhetoric Bannon and Kylie Bass use. It's not at all helpful. By the way, I need to go now.
Peter Navarro. Let's just round up on a thought then. we have just gone through the coronavirus, the greatest experiment in economic history, shutting down huge, vast parts of the global economy, people staying at home. Just a few words, if you may, what should people be doing? Should they be getting back into the stock market at this time, or would you practice or
well, as I said already before, and this is my strategy for the last few years, you don't know how the world will look like in 5 years' time. And if the bureaucracy managed to tell you to stay at home and lock you in and treat you the way they treated some people, I think we really don't know what there will come up next to us. So my position has always been to be diversified. You own some real estate, and you own some shares, and you own some bonds and cash, and you own some precious metals. And everybody has to choose the allocation. But I think that under the conditions we have, it makes sense to increase the allocation to precious metals and maybe also own some bitcoins. You understand? I'm not the person that buys when the sun is out and sells when it's raining. So I was prepared for the downturn that occurred, and I've added to some positions, and I also made some switches to positions, but I haven't changed anything dramatically in my portfolio. So this is the answer.
Okay, and just a final word. Whenever I mention the word gold, people just like to hear that name. At this level, I'm seeing it was 1740 this afternoon. It had a jump up. Are you still optimistic on, or are we getting to levels where it's looking too bubbly?
Yes, but I just like to emphasize what we've seen between January 1st and today in asset markets, in stock markets, in currency markets, even in precious metals and precious metal shares. You can have high volatility. So we are at 70.30 on the gold price today. Who knows? It could drop to 1,400 or 1,500. We had oil that traded at negative prices. Nobody would have ever thought this possible.
Yeah,
certainly I would never have thought it's possible to have negative prices. But it happened. So I'm telling everyone, don't put all your money in gold today, and then it drops 10% and you're wiped out. So everything with caution. As you drive on a wet road, you need to be a little bit more cautious than when the road is in perfect condition and dry. And you can easily slip if the road is wet or icy or there is snow. But this is about investment at the present time. We need to be careful. And volatility will stay, and in my view, will increase.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Faber. Thank you for your time this evening, and speak to you again soon. All right. Take care.
Give my regards to Steve Bannon.
All right.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.